I want to give a big shout out to LSU right now for finger snaps and hand claps. They're doing all the presenters, all the people that showed up, all the people that have driven here, all the people that have arrived here. My name is Monica, and I'm the co-chair of the ACGA National 43rd Community Gardening Association Conference. Super happy to be here. Super humbled that everybody is here. This has been like something that I want to check off my professional itinerary for a very long time is to host a conference. And so thank you so much. Couldn't have done it without everybody here. And I just want to also talk about National Wildlife Federation and Louisiana Conservation Champions. This is a program through National Wildlife Federation. Part of this funding right here is paid for them or paid from them. And we want to really promote cover cropping and rotational grazing in the state of Louisiana because we are losing soil and we could be a lot more productive in our growing. And so Dr. Fultz here this is her expertise, and so we have partnered together. She's a conservation champion for National Wildlife Federation. I want to give finger snaps and hand claps to them and help us for this funding. So I just want to raise your hand if you do any kind of cover cropping whatsoever, or if you know what that is, or how valuable it is. All right.
Well, then you don't need me to talk. You guys are all the experts.
Yeah, so we're done. And so I'm going to hand it over to Lisa, and I really appreciate you all being here, and I really appreciate Lisa being here.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And I do want to thank everyone for inviting me. I'm coming at this from a little different perspective. Probably one of the few people on the agenda who don't actually have an extension appointment. I'm just in research and teaching, but I do a lot of talks, and I can talk about soils and conservation and cover crops for days. So I'll try to keep it short though. I am a soil microbiologist, traditionally trained in soil sciences, and a lot of my work is on conservation. A lot of my work is on large-scale row crop production and that kind of thing. I also work in grazing lands. And when they asked me to talk about it in the relationship to community gardens, I realized that there's really not that big of a difference. There are two key factors I think that play a role here. One of them is scale. It could go from somebody's container garden on their patio to large-scale community gardens up to acres of land that they're producing on. So not too different in that perspective, but what is really different is when you're planting cover crops. So if I'm talking to a producer who's maybe growing corn or cotton, they're planting in a specific window, and then they have pretty much a specific window where they're not doing anything with their land. For community gardens, you guys are trying to produce as much as you can out of that site. You may not have time to take a break and put something in that you're not harvesting. So we'll talk a little bit about what the benefits of cover crops are and how some ways you might be able to work them into different systems. So I first wanted to start out and just talk about, well, okay, what's a cover crop? How does that differ from a green manure? And really, it comes down to how are you using it. A cover crop, the main goal is putting in something that's going to cover the ground and protect it from wind or water erosion. Louisiana, we get over 68 inches of rainfall every year, and if you've seen any of the stuff, when those raindrops hit the ground, it's like a small bomb going off every time. And any soil that you lose is all the resources you put, all your time and money and effort is being lost every time you lose a little bit of that topsoil. So we're trying to do things that protect that topsoil. Some people will also refer to it as a green manure. It's very, very similar. It's still a cover crop, but what you're doing in that case is usually going in when it's still green and incorporating it into the soil to increase fertility and increase organic matter. But it's still something that you're not planning to harvest for anything at the end of the year. And so the first question I almost always get asked when I go to talk about cover crops is, okay, well, so what cover crop do I plant? And my answer is always, well, it depends. What do you want from that cover crop? What role do you see that cover crop fulfilling in your system? When do you need a cover crop? Are you looking at something that's a cold season, a warm season? Does it need to have a short growing period? Do you have a longer available window? And how much are you ready to spend? So when you're buying a cover crop in bulk, I found these were prices I was looking at the other day. You're looking at 48 cents to a pound to 2.5 a pound, which may or may not be a big deal. The other side of that is how much are you putting out? And that's gonna depend on the size of the area that you're trying to fulfill and what you want to get out of it. For some of the grasses and everything, their prices are typically cheaper, less than $1 per pound, but you're gonna buy them or put out more seed for those than you would for, say, like some clover or some cowpea. You might plant those at lower rates, so it might be worth it to invest in those seeds if you want those benefits. And then, where are you growing this? Are you growing it in a container? Are you growing it in native soil? Is it very clay? Is it very sandy? All of those things are also going to play a role in what cover crops work best for your environment. We know that certain clovers just don't do well in soils that stay wet year round. So I'm obviously not going to say, yeah, you should go put crimson clover in if your soil stays wet most of the year. You're not going to get much out of it. So when do you do that? And like I said, how does this change for community gardens? It really just comes down to what's your planting window. When is it going to be best to fit into your growing cycle throughout the year? If you're doing something where you're pretty much planting year round, then you may look at something like intercropping, where instead of sort of rotating out of a crop that you're harvesting, you're using those middle spaces between your rows and putting in something that's a little bit of a ground cover there, that you could also maybe incorporate into the soil and use as a nutrient source. So it really comes down to what is the space that you're trying to fit this into. Do your crops have specific needs? And then again, soil texture. Like I said, I'm a trained soil scientist. At some point, I'm going to work soil into the conversation. I actually have friends that are like, I don't know anything about soil, but anytime someone says dirt, I correct them because I know you're listening somewhere. So in community gardens, the main thing is you're putting it in anytime an area is not being used. And that may be as simple as it's inner row spaces where you're not planting something at that time, to maybe you go into a cool season where you don't really have any vegetables, flowers, or plants that you would harvest that you can use. That's an optimum time to throw out a cool season cover and just let it build up in the soil. You build up those nutrients, you scavenge nutrients that maybe you put out before through fertilizer applications, so that it'll still be there when you go in and plant in the spring next year. And then you can incorporate that biomass. Generally, we'll say to do that a couple weeks before you're going to plant the crop you're harvesting. There's a couple reasons for that. One of them is some of these crops may be hosts for other insects or diseases that might be a problem for you. So you want to be aware of any of those issues. And then, particularly when we're talking about the grasses, there is some chemicals that they'll produce that might actually hinder growth of other species, which is called allelopathy. And so we want to try and minimize that as much as we can. So just be careful about what you're selecting. So I'm just going to go through some of the basic cover crops and the ones that we commonly recommend. So for legumes, these are fantastic because a legume plant will make a relationship with bacteria in the soil. That bacteria will actually take nitrogen out of the atmosphere and convert it into a plant available form. So you don't actually have to supply it with nitrogen at all. It can grow just by having that organism present in the soil. What that's great for from a cover crop is that that's nitrogen that you can use for your next cash crop. They can also produce a lot of wonderful blooms. This is crimson clover here. And you can see all of that are fantastic blooms for pollinators. And then also, if you have animals that you want to incorporate into your system, you can use them for mulches, you can use them for grazing and that kind of thing. Now they are slow to establish, so if you're looking for something to come in very quickly in a very short window, these may not be the best choice for that scenario. And they might require inoculation, especially if it's something that hasn't been grown in that soil before. So that might add a little bit of a cost, but they do have recommended inoculants for the different cover crops that you can use. And this one is probably my biggest pet peeve about them. Some of these cover crops will vine like crazy. If you've ever grown green beans or something like that, it's the same thing. They will take over. I don't know what I'm touching. They will take over entire areas. We grew some cowpeas last couple of years for variety trials. They not only took over all the plots in the same treatments, growing over on top of each other, they were growing into my neighbor's research plots, climbing up all the signs and everything. It was insanity. We tried to redesign it this year where there was more space between the plots. and they just took over all that. It is phenomenal for ground cover if you're trying to build up that ground cover and protect your soil. But if you're trying to grow something else right next to it, you might just be collecting whatever that viney cover crop is instead.
Can you explain inoculation?
So inoculation is putting a seed coating on there that has the bacteria, the nitrogen fixing bacteria already in it. And so what happens is basically you're infecting that seed from germination through its life cycle. And there are specific species of bacteria, most of them are in the rhizobia or bradyrhizobia families, that are specific to different types of like soybean, cowpea, crimson clover, all have ones that work best with those. And so they'll actually provide you with ones that you can coat your seed with, and it just sort of gives them a boost. A lot of these organisms live in the soil already, but they may be in such low numbers that they don't really interact with the plant. And what happens, I don't know if you guys can see it very well, it's not the greatest picture, but all these little bumps, this is on some of our clover roots. Those are little, yeah, sorry.
Go ahead.
Okay. They are little areas where the plant has actually made a habitat for the bacteria to live that allows it to fix the nitrogen, and then it's providing trading carbohydrates to the bacteria within the plant root. And what's really cool, if you take this little nodule, crack it open, and it's a red or pinkish color, you know it's actively fixing nitrogen. If you crack it open and it's a tan color, then it made the little habitat. It's not actually doing anything. So, yeah.
What is microbiology?
Microbiology is the study of microorganisms like bacteria, fungi, actinomycetes that all live well anywhere. I study them that specifically live in the soil, but there are ones that live in you everywhere. You can study them in all kinds of places.
Oh, wow.
I broke it.
Dr. Fultz, while you're waiting for that to come back up, where would someone get inoculants?
So most of them, if you're buying from seed sources that specifically are providing that seed, they'll actually sell you the inoculant as well. A lot of times when you can buy the seed, it's actually pre-treated. And some of those you have to plant pretty quickly because the inoculants don't necessarily last a long time. I can keep going about it, but you can buy them at the company that you get the seed from. And that is something to actually keep in mind when you're looking at how much seed do I put out. If you're putting out a specific amount, that seed coating might add weight to your seed, so you might have to put out a little bit more seed to compensate for that change. Anytime there's a coating on the seed, it's going to change the amount of pure live seed that's in the bag to what you would actually expect.
So you can't buy the inoculant and do a shake and bake?
You can.
Okay.
Yeah, you can buy untreated seed. If you're doing it for like the smaller packets and stuff, probably pre-treated. If you're buying from bigger places, yeah, that's how we buy all ours. Because we buy in bulk, and we don't know when we're gonna get to plant stuff. They might be months away. So then we'll do a treatment at plant. Yeah.
I don't know if you're gonna get to this, or not, but what about, no-till? Will you be achieving the same thing if you do a no-till, or you're planting a cover crop also for the nutrients?
So it depends on, if you're doing legumes, the legumes are gonna bring in something that no-till won't do. So no-till is fantastic because you're not disturbing the soil, you're not breaking up all the organic material, and you're not breaking up the fungi and their hyphae and everything that come from them. But it's not really, it's not bringing in extra nutrients. And if you don't have something growing during sort of your off season, it's not potentially scavenging the nutrients that might be in excess in your soil. So it won't necessarily help build up new nutrients, but it will help with cycling of nutrients because your microbial community is also going to respond positively to that. And so they're helping to break down organic material a little bit and release nutrients back into the soil that other plants can use. Yeah. Other questions?
If you, let's say you, planted a cover crop and then till, like that would be pretty pointless?
Not necessarily pointless. It depends on what your goal is. If your goal is soil fertility, that's fine. if your goal is to build organic matter and have surface cover to reduce that, then tillage is not necessarily going to be the first choice. Now that I say that, knowing that I live in a place where it rains a huge amount, and tillage is just part of our production systems. You might look at, if you're interested in reducing disturbance, you might look at like shallow tillage or strip till or something like that, where you're only going in the area where you're not planting directly into, and then work from there. So what I was going to talk about after that slide was I have a table that if anybody wants any copies of this, I'm happy to share it. But it was just showing how much nitrogen you can actually get from legumes. And so for things like clovers, it's anywhere from 70 to 220 pounds of nitrogen in the whole plant. Now the thing to keep in mind is that's all tied up in organic material, so leaves, stems, roots. Only about half of the nitrogen that's in the plant is actually going to be plant available. So even if your plant has 200 pounds of nitrogen in it per acre, you're probably only going to see about 100 of that for your plant. Now, and I have some research that shows it, we've seen in plots where we never put out nitrogen, we just had legume cover crops. We saw a 50% increase in corn yield compared to where no cover crop had been planted. Not the greatest corn yields because they never got nitrogen, but they're still 50 times better than what we were seeing in other stuff. When we increased our nitrogen application to 80 pounds per acre, cool. But when we increased that to 80 pounds per acre, we actually were seeing the highest yields in our legume plots. So we were actually halving the normal recommendation of nitrogen and still getting some of our highest yields when we followed it with legumes, or followed with legumes.
I have a question, Lisa. For people who want to expand their community garden and don't, I know that when I was doing production gardening, I couldn't get to every spot in my garden. And so what's a really good system of putting a cover crop down and letting that do its thing while you're kind of doing a master plan of a community garden?
So if you're just looking for some kind of restoration for an area that maybe you're not utilizing at that time.
Absolutely. There's lots of places in New Orleans that the soil is very, very thin, and that's what I'm asking.
So the main thing that you want to watch for, because you can, once you know the type of soil that you're working in and sort of when you're going to be planting it, are you planting it in the fall, or are you going to be planting it in the spring, then you can get an idea of which ones you should plant. And then ideally, the goal is you're not applying anything else to it, and you're letting it do its thing and grow over the however many months. If you're at all concerned about that stuff becoming a weed in the system, then you want to get to it before it starts putting on seed. And now if you want to collect seed for using for future years, you can let it keep going. But if that's it at all, then you want to maybe mow it or cut it, or if you can, chemical termination will work too. And if you live in some place where it actually gets cold enough in the winter and you're doing cool season covers, you can let it winter kill. That never happens here. We had a week of it's like 30 degrees Celsius or 30 degrees temperature. My radishes got like a little bit of kill, like some of the leaves fell off. And then they came back with a vengeance just after that. So, all right. Yeah, so this is just what I was showing you. I won't spend any time on it, but you can see this is no nitrogen, 48% increase, and then here's our legumes at 80 pounds. So we're getting like our highest yields and half the nitrogen application rate. I don't know, I have it in my hand. And then this is that table. So you can see 75 to 220 pounds in Berseem and crimson clover. Cowpeas, sun hemp, 80 to 175 pounds of nitrogen in that. Grasses are fantastic if you have a weed problem. They will come in, they do early establishment, and they will outcompete most weeds that might come into your system. And I'll show some of that. They also have these really nice fibrous and deep root systems, which help them pick up any extra nutrients that are in your soil. And they incorporate that into their roots, into their shoots, and their leaves and everything. And then when this biomass lays down on the soil surface, you now have a nutrient source for your next crops. in the next year. They are competitive, which is great from a weed perspective, but they may be an issue if you're planting like a mix of cover crops. If they establish early and they come in early, they may outcompete some of the other things in that mixture. And like I said, with those allelopathic potential impacts depending on what you're planting the next year. This is looking at weed suppression. So you can see this first bar are the weed populations we had at 2 different locations. And these are all the different mixes of cover crops we planted. And there's almost no weeds in any of those. In this is northern Louisiana, Winsboro, it's mostly henbent and small forbs that we're dealing with. In Alexandria, I had beautiful stands of annual rye grass that I did not plant. And you can see here, we didn't have as good suppression in every case, partly because of the difference in how we're seeding, but we're really doing pretty well at controlling that population where we get the biomass. If we don't get a lot of biomass like this one here, we still see those weeds getting into that system. And then nutrient scavenging. This is looking at, I was talking about the extra nutrient. So this is in fall after we planted corn, and you can see where we put out nitrogen, there's quite a bit left over. When we go into the spring after the cover crops, there's almost no nitrogen left, and there's no difference depending on how much. So we know that those plants and those leaves are taking up all that extra nutrient and tying it up to be used when that biomass is killed. Grasses, usually something like cereal rye, barley, oats, rye grass. Generally here in Louisiana, if I recommend rye grass to anyone who's not grazing, they will throw me off their farm. So the main thing I would say here, if you want to look at rye grass, be very careful of your seed source. We have a big problem with herbicide-resistant ryegrass. So if it gets into your system, it's very hard to get rid of. So that's the main thing. And then if you're looking at warm season, something like sorghum, Sudan grass is a good one. And then brassicas and boards, these kind of are a different system, partly because a lot of these are actually ones you might be growing in a community garden for harvesting, not really for cover crops. But they are great for suppressing weeds because they do a lot of early season establishment. And they have chemicals that they produce that, when that's incorporated into the soil, can actually use as a fumigant for things like nematodes and other insects and pests that might be a problem for you. And these are things like radishes, turnips, mustards, rapeseed, canola, sunflower, buckwheat are all great ones for different environments. These are just, as I can talk about the benefits of cover crops all day, but there are still things to keep in mind. There is a little bit of seed cost, because again, this is not something you're necessarily going to directly benefit from as far as getting the fruits and vegetables and flowers and things that you might be growing. It could become a weed if you're not terminating and taking care of that correctly. Because establishment times vary, if you want to do mixes or something like that, you really have to consider what would fit best in your system.